Are you all set?
Yes, I'm all set. And it's recording.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Kirkland Arts Center. My name is Star Rush, and I'm the education director here, and the executive director for our nonprofit art school and gallery space. And we also are stewards of this building, the Peter Kirk building, and it was built in 1892. The oldest building on Earth. Keep it up and have a space where the community can come in and engage with what we do here. We're prepping right now in the gallery space for our annual holiday art market. Like you can come back then. It opens on the 17th of November. So we're hosting 58 artists and makers and crafters and their wares. And we'll have more hours. Yeah. And today, I'm going to introduce Artemise Janeski, who is has a day job here at the Art Center. She's the education coordinator. She's my colleague in the education department. And then she has this other kid. So she teaches art history at Digipen over the hill there in Redmond. And she's an art historian in graduate school second.
I have a punch card and everything.
And we're really happy. She's been doing these artist talks for us this fall, the pilot. Forward, different types of talks too. So in the audience, for a maker, a designer, artist, let us know and into future artist talks. So thank you for joining us today, and turn it over to Annalisa.
Thank you for that lovely opening, Star. Like you said, my name is Annalisa, and although I'm a specialist in medieval art, I really can't pick a favorite. It's like asking someone to pick a favorite child or a favorite book. So Baroque is definitely up there for me. And so today we're going to be discussing the Baroque Extravaganza. And so this kind of builds off of my last talk on Renaissance Italy. You don't have to have been there for the last talk. It's totally okay. This is just if you were there, you've got some background information. But if you weren't, then we're not going to really worry about it. It's totally okay. So Baroque is actually kind of a funny word because it comes to us from the Portuguese word of Baraco, which means a weird shaped pearl. And I know that's just like oddly specific way to describe a period, but it actually came about as kind of an insult, if believe it or not, because we have in the Italian Renaissance, just a quick recap, very structured art, right? We have like the same kind of pyramidal composition. We have things that are balanced. Everybody has kind of a neutral, very little emotion. So it's very stoic art. And then the Baroque comes in and we're all about drama. We're all about grandeur. We're all about emotion. And so people saw this and they're like, oh, this is kind of weird. Like, why is everybody fainting or like exaggerating their emotions? And so they just kind of called it Baroque as a joke. And it did not mean that to rhyme, but it did. So Baroque focuses on these irregular ideas in art. And so it became associated with these ideas of a weirdly shaped pearl. These are actually a set of pearl earrings that I took off of a jeweler's website. They're actually still called Baroque pearls to this day. So if you want to get a set of jewelry with weird shaped pearls, not the perfect spheres, you can actually search Baroque pearls, which I think is kind of a fun like carryover into the modern era. So the markers of Baroque art, this is a very generalized idea of the period, but it's kind of things that we see across cultures. I'm going to focus primarily in Italy today because I'm not gonna lie, that's my favorite type of Baroque art, but we also see it captured in other countries. The Dutch Golden Age, we see that with Rembrandt and Peter Paul Rubens, and then the Spanish Golden Age, which we see with artists like Diego Velázquez. They are amazing. I highly recommend you check them out, but with only an hour, I kind of had to zero in on just one place, so I'm gonna pick my favorite. I'm gonna pick Italy. This is where we see an extreme contrast of light and dark. So if you were at my last lecture, I talked about Leonardo da Vinci and his use of the term sfumato. and the term of chiaroscuro, so light dark, those are taken to be extreme in the Baroque period. It's called tenebrism, is that word on the screen. We also see a lot of emotion and drama in the work. So instead of seeing simple compositional designs of the Virgin Mary just holding the Christ child, you might see more dramatic of her like throwing her head back holding the Christ child. They're just imbued with a more emotional sense. There's also going to be a lot of counter-Reformation themes, which I'll talk about in the next slide, but a heavy emphasis on the stories of the Bible. And in sculpture, we see the use of the S curve. So essentially, that's exactly what it sounds like. It's where bodies or forms are made in such a way that they appear like these letter S in languages, in Latin-based languages. So the Counter-Reformation, which I just mentioned, is a revival of the Catholic faith. In my last lecture, I talked about, and most of us heard about, especially in this part of the country, the Protestant Reformation, where Martin Luther came and he was like, not so good with all of these rules in the Catholic Church. And so I think we should get some reform. Protestantism exploded, especially in Central and Western Europe, up into Northern Europe as well, and eventually came over to the Americas. And the church needed to do something about it. For 1,500 years, the Catholic Church was the church in Europe, right? They were the ones who had the final say in religion and how people worshipped, in the ideas of Christianity. And all of a sudden, there was a lot of competition. So Pope Paul III, he came up with the Council of Trent. And so this actually went past his own tenure as Pope. He passed away before the council ended, but it was 25 different sessions. They held them in Trent, and then in a few other places, including Worms, Germany. So I think it's funny, it was like the Diet of Worms, which Diet's an ecclesiastical conference, but it just sounds gross. And like, you couldn't have picked a better place for history. Like, come on. And they got together, the Pope and a bunch of bishops from all over Christendom, and came up with ideas of, okay, what reforms do we need to make sure people come back to us or they stick with us? And how can we advertise that we are the number one, right? Catholic is the only way to go. And they thought of art. People like art. I mean, even back then, now we like art maybe for other reasons than it helps us focus on our personal beliefs. We like it because it's pretty or it represents something that we see within ourselves. But then back then they saw it as a way to kind of become a PR campaign, like one giant universal PR campaign. And so the church started hiring more and more artists to paint Christian themes. They started working more and more on the rebuilding of St. Peter's Church, which I'll talk a little bit about later in the lecture. And they really used artistic creation as a way to push the agenda of the Catholic Church. And so most of the works that we see during this period, particularly in Italy, are focused on Christian themes. So the first artist, him and the other male artist, actually the one female artist, him and the other male artist, Bernini, I call them the bad boys of the Baroque. Not just because it's an alliteration, because I love an alliteration, but because it's true. So this is Caravaggio. He is kind of like Cher, Madonna. He's known by one name, Caravaggio, partially because his first name is Michelangelo, so you can't confuse the two. So like, he was from a town called Caravaggio. It's up near Milan. He called himself this, so it worked. So he was labeled, this is not something he labeled himself, but a lot of people, once his reputation came up, called him the greatest painter in Rome. Yes, he was from up near Milan, but if you wanted to make it as an artist during this period, you had to go get that sweet, sweet church money and commissions. So you made yourself to the center of the Catholic world, which was Rome. So he went down there as a young man in his late teens, and he started working in the city, and he was really poor. He was selling basically these scrap canvases with his works on it until he caught the eye of a cardinal, Cardinal Almonte, and the cardinal saw something special in him. So he brought him into his personal residence under his patronage, so he was paid a small stipend, and then produced works that the cardinal could buy at a very discounted rate. And that's kind of how he got his fame. And eventually he got passed around almost. People wanted Caravaggio under the roof. He became very, very famous. And he is the one that we credit with the invention of tenebrism, that extreme contrast between light and dark. He is not a good person, though. He is a horrible person. He had a temper like no other. Like, think about, I don't know if anybody here is a baseball fan, but Lou Piniella throwing the bases in the olden days of the Seattle Mariners, but like at a level above that. Like, that's how angry he was all the time. He was very mercurial. Like, one minute he would be laughing, the other minute he would be crying with rage. There's a story, and this is an actual true story. Like, they have the arrest record archives. People in Rome saved every scrap of paper, so you can go to an archive if you're an academic and actually like read the original arrest record of this incident, where Caravaggio was so mad that a waiter overcooked his artichokes. Artichokes are a big deal in Rome. Instead of sending it back, he went full on Karen and threw the plate of hot steaming artichokes in the guy's face and like disfigured him from the hot oil. And there are multiple incidents. He got in a few street fights, and then over a girl, he got in a street fight with someone who had connections, and he accidentally severed his femoral artery, and the guy bled out in the street. Even though Caravaggio at this point had a lot of cardinals and bishops like in his friends circle, he had to flee the city because there was basically you can arrest him or kill him on sight because he's wanted for murder. And so Caravaggio kind of went around southern Italy. He stopped in Sicily, stopped in Malta, and he eventually died. Somebody believes that it's of lead poisoning from his work. Others believe he got an infected sword cut. They did find his body, or what they believe was his body, and there's evidence of both, so we're not entirely sure. But he did die as a result of something in his life, and it was a very dramatic end for a very dramatic man. So he was not a nice person, but God, his art's so good. It's so hard to, because I want to acknowledge the person that he was in his art, but it's just so pretty. It's so hard for me to separate the two sometimes. So this is The Calling of St. Matthew, and this is Caravaggio's kind of breakout piece. And so he was working for a cardinal from France whose name was Matthew, and the cardinal wanted some paintings of the saint where he took his name on the church. And this church is actually a French church in Rome. It's the center of like all the French people that live in the city, called it's the Church of San Luigi or St. Louis. And there's 3 paintings in this little chapel. You can go see them today. It's totally free. That's what I love about Caravaggio. He did a lot of church paintings. So you can just wander in and be like, oh, it's a Caravaggio. Like, that doesn't happen here in Washington. And so what Caravaggio is known for is using light to tell a story. And this is kind of the first instance where we see that. So St. Matthew was a tax collector in the Bible, aka the tax man, the IRS. Nobody liked him. But Christ saw his potential as a disciple, as a believer. And so Christ actually handpicked Matthew to come along with him. And eventually we know Matthew wrote one of the Gospels, and, very important. And this is the moment when Matthew was with his tax collecting friends, and they're counting their wages. And tax collectors in the biblical times were really corrupt, because as long as they got the right amount of tax, anything else they got to put in their pocket. So if you owed $100 in tax, he could charge you $300 and pocket that extra $200 for himself as a tip. So that's why they were so hated. But Christ saw the potential. And so if you look in the very far corner, there's Christ pointing, and it's almost a languid pointing. It's supposed to remind us of Michelangelo's, conveniently I have it right here on my arm, of the creation of man, this very languid kind of, you are the one I'm choosing. And Matthew's looking at him like, you're talking to me? Like, what? I'm a tax collector. I'm not the kind of person that you want with your bands. But Christ picked everybody, right? He didn't discriminate against anybody. And so that's why it was such a powerful moment in the Gospels. And we can see the light isn't coming in from the dirty window, but in fact, it's coming from another source, maybe an open door, maybe it's Christ's halo, which is a very thin gold band. It's hard to see in most like screens. You kind of have to get really close to look at it. But it's such a beautiful moment that's captured with the story. You can see the one guy on the very far left, he's like got his head down, like, don't look at me, Jesus. I don't want to come with you. And so there's this humanity in the moment too. Like, imagine this guy you've heard about wandering through Israel, preaching and kind of going against the status quo, is suddenly handpicking you. Like, you're going to be like, me? I'm a bad person. And so his just way of using dynamic movement and light to tell stories is just, it's unparalleled until this point. This next one, he's painted around the same time. It's in another church. It's actually like on the complete opposite side of Rome. And it's called The Crucifixion of St. Peter. And again, we're seeing the humanity and tenebrism in his works. And so St. Peter was the first pope. So that's a major counter-Reformation scene we're seeing right here. We've got to prop up the Catholic Church. And St. Peter is the disciple that Christ chose to build his church upon. In the Bible, it says, you have Peter, upon this rock I will build the church. Peter means rock in Greek, Petros. And so in 66 CE, when Peter was an old man living in Rome, kind of establishing the roots of the first church, of the Catholic Church, Peter was caught up in the politics of the Great Fire under Emperor Nero. And Nero, there's no evidence of who started. I mean, this is 2,000 years ago. But Nero was like, conveniently, there's this cult called the Christians. We should just blame them for the giant fire that destroyed a lot of the city. And his like senators and stuff who didn't want to cross him were like, great idea, man, blame the Christians. And because Peter was the head of the Christian cult, he was the one that was executed for it. And they ordered him to be crucified. Not because it was a symbol of Jesus, but because crucifixion is the most humiliating form of execution in kind of the Roman playbook of how to execute people you don't like. And so Peter was taken aback and he said, I can't be crucified because otherwise that would be the same way that our Lord was crucified. And I can't do that. I'm not worthy to die of Jesus. So he requested to be crucified upside down. And crucifixion is already a horrific manner of death, but upside down makes it even worse. And so here we see an old, almost shriveled man. Like he's not this glory pope, like he's not the head of the church. He's an old man who's scared. And the Romans who are getting ready to crucify him, they're anonymous. We don't know who they are. We can't see their faces. The light is projected only onto Peter, and the rest of the work is in shadow. And you can look at, if you look at the guy's who's kind of using his back to lift up the heavy cross, you can see the way the muscles are straining, and the forearms of the guy who's kind of lifting the butt end of the cross up. You can see the veins in the muscles. And so this shows Caravaggio's technical expertise. But what I love is that it's just this frail old man who's scared in the moment. And that is what's going to resonate with the viewer. It's not the Pope being crucified. It's not this glory-filled moment. It's about the humanity of what they had to sacrifice to allow Christianity, to allow Catholicism to flourish 2,000 years later. That's also why the symbol for the Catholic Church is an upside-down cross. It's not satanic. It's actually very like appropriate for it. People just, when the satanic panic hit in the 80s, that's why they thought it was that way. But it's like 2,000-year-old symbol. I love this painting. It's not as dramatic as the others, but it's funny. I'll tell you why. So the Madonna di Loreto. So Loreto is a town in Italy, and miraculously, they have the house where the Virgin Mary died. Yeah, she didn't die in Italy. She died over in the Middle East, but one night angels lifted it off its foundation and it landed in Loreto, Italy. I'm not here to judge. I'm just telling the story. So the church asked Caravaggio, okay, can we paint this of the Madonna Loreto? Loreto's not that far from Rome. Like it's well within a pilgrimage journey. And can you paint a picture of her with Jesus and some pilgrims to show like how the journeys work? Okay. The church received this painting and they literally, okay, they didn't literally say WTF, but I bet they thought it. Do you want to know what's so offensive about this painting? Dirty feet. The pilgrims have dirty feet. How dare you put dirty feet in the house of the Lord? But it makes them human. And that's what Caravaggio is trying to emphasize. He argued back that I'm not going to show some pilgrim who was, carried on a litter with their servants walking to the house of Loreto. I'm going to show the humblest of pilgrims who are going because they have something really important they need to pray to the Madonna about. And that probably means that they don't have shoes, because going on pilgrimage could take anywhere from, a week to a year. And so you have to give up your livelihood for a long time in order to make these religious trips. And so Caravaggio wanted to show the humblest of people making this trip to Loreto. And so they had to give up their shoes. They're older. They have walking sticks leaning up against their shoulders as they're praying to the Madonna for help of whatever is afflicting them. And so it's this story that's just told through dirty feet. And that's what Caravaggio tried to show people. They were also pretty ticked off because the Madonna is based off of his mistress, who was a sex worker. So there was another thing against him. But the dirty feet is really what got them, which I find hilarious. Like, yeah. And she shows up later too. She shows up in a lot of his works. He was just using what he had access to. I mean, you got to do what you got to do in the art world sometimes. And also baby Jesus is really weirdly proportioned. It's just a fun fact, right? I know it's like right, it's like really weirdly proportioned. That's a holdover from late Renaissance work called Mannerism, where everything is just super elongated. Again, it's about that visual dynamicness. It's like not quite right, so you've got to look at it more. But dirty feet. My students, I showed this to them a couple weeks ago. Yeah. There is some evidence that he was gay, but he also had mistresses. He might have been bi. There is a strong indicator that he is. Yeah, that he was homosexual, but he also had a mistress or two, and so maybe he was fluid. It's hard to assign those things when you're so many years later, but it's one of those weird mysteries. Like, was he gay? Because he definitely painted some people, and you're like, ooh. You were a little like, but that's fine. Whatever works, right? So this is called the death of the Virgin. And so according to Christian theology, the Virgin Mary was around 60-ish when she died. And when she died, her body was taken up into heaven by angels, leaving nothing behind, kind of like how her son was brought up. And she became the queen of heaven. And this is primarily in Catholic theology. You don't see it really mentioned when you get to Protestantism. And she knew it was going to be her time soon. So she wrote to all the disciples that she could get a hold of, basically, and said, come to my home. I want to see you before I die. So we can all remember our times together, basically. And so the church, again, asked Caravaggio, can you paint a death of the Virgin scene for us? And mostly it's like this glory triumph, like she had been the mother of God, the mother of Christ. And now after 30-odd years, she was finally going to go join her son as the queen of heaven. Does this look like it's a glory, happy-filled moment? This is easier to see if you zoom in. Wikipedia is great for zooming in on most images because people have used their high resolution cameras and then uploaded under the Creative Commons license. So I highly recommend Wikipedia in that specific case. He actually paints her with green undertones as if she's already dead. And if you look at her stomach, it's a little bit bloated. Like she's already starting to, I hate to use the word decay, but CSI situation. So the fact that he had the audacity to use his sex worker friend as the Mary again, and then paint her as if she's been dead for a while and she's starting to puff up with gases, they like literally threw him out of the church that he was supposed to put this up in. They're like, GTFO, this is so offensive. And again, he was pushing the boundaries. He's like, you told me to paint death. I painted death. Like, I don't know what more you want. And just the way that the light is streaming in, but it's starting to fade almost. Like the light of the Virgin's glory is fading now that she has finally left this earth. And the only person who seems super sad is St. John, who's standing right above her, going like this, and then her handmaiden, which is sitting. Everyone else is kind of just sitting there. Like, what do we do now? Mom's dead. Like, that's really what it feels like. And so again, we see this like just awkward. Caravaggio took the assignment a little too literally. Yes, sir. Oh no, you can ask now. Not really in this case. There's a lot of red in Baroque art because you could achieve a lot of depth with it, and it had a light red to dark red. There's so much depth within that, not like with other colors, and it's a natural color, right? It's easy pigment to get a hold to. You can use something as simple as rust from the dirt as opposed to like a precious gemstone like you would with blue. Yeah, Caravaggio uses a lot of red. All right, now that we're done with Caravaggio, I thought I'd give us a break from the bad boys. I thought we'd have, this is still going to have a depressing story, but Artemise Janeski is one of the first artists in art history that's a woman that we recognize in the West. Before that, artists were either anonymous or women weren't allowed to do art. I am obsessed with Artemise Janeski. Like I just love her story, and it's amazing as a woman to hear it and to be inspired by it. And so Artemise Janeski was the daughter of a relatively successful artist and close friend of Caravaggio, Orazio Janeski, and she lived and grew up in Rome. And she had brothers, but her father actually noticed how much better at art that she was than her brothers, and he took her into his studio, which is just absolutely revolutionary for the time. Like, fathers did not do this, but he saw that his daughter had been the one in the family to inherit what he had learned. And so he trained her up and really worked with her to develop her skill. And this next part has a little bit of a trigger warning. We're going to talk about sexual assault, but not in any details, just warning. But there was a young artist working with her father named Agostino Tosi, and Tosi saw Artemise and thought she was attractive and said, let's go hang out. And he ended up assaulting her. But then he promised that he would marry her because she was a virgin when this happened. And she agreed. Okay, we'll get married. That's the right thing to do. And he continued to assault her under this banner of, well, we're going to get married anyway, so it doesn't really count. And eventually her father found out, and she confessed what had been happening because it was violent. It was not okay. And she soon realized that even though he promised to marry her, like, this wasn't the life that she wanted for herself. And so her father actually took Tosi to court, not because he had been assaulting his daughter, but because he broke a contract. Yeah. And in order to verify her story of being assaulted, the court put her through torture. And not the insane torture we see on like the Spanish Inquisition with the screws and breaking the spine and everything. But it was still bad. And unfortunately, the records do still survive, and so you can read the firsthand account of like the court reporter writing it. And it's very sad. I don't want to repeat it here, but it is very sad. But she did it. And she stood up for herself in court and faced the man that had hurt her. And she actually came out on top. Now, it was more about he broke the marriage contract, so he owed her father money, which, is another thing aside. But he was banished from the city of Rome, and nobody remembers him today for his art. They only remember him as someone who sexually assaulted a great artist. So in the end, in the historical sense of it, she came out on top, right? Nobody cares about Agostino Tosi other than he's a footnote in her life. But what Artemise did is she turned her pain into power, when this is something that women are still learning how to do in the 21st century. And she's kind of that first famous woman that we can look to that took her rage and her hurt and her anger, poured it into her art, and now she's one of the most famous artists. They just found a new work attributed to her. It's actually just announced in this month's edition of Burlington magazine, which is like, if you find something and you get it announced at Burlington. It's like the Vogue of the art history world. And it was randomly in the collection of the royal family of Great Britain, and it had just been stashed away. And some art historian had found it. She worked in England for a while, so she probably did it while I was there, and then it got stashed away when the monarchy fell under Charles I. So it was announced, it was a huge thing, it was all over the art newspapers, and so she's still making waves today, and that's just amazing for someone who is almost a footnote because of what happened to her. So this is her first major commission. This is called Susanna and the Elders, and it's really a painting about feminism and shame and the power struggle between men and women. So in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Susanna is a lovely young woman, and she's taking a bath. And in those days, your bath was outside. And these two creepy old men were being peeping Toms, and they tried to get with her. And she said, no, I'm a virgin. I respect my father. Like, I'm going to be a virgin until I'm married. Like, go away. So they were mad that she had rejected them. And they went to the court and accused her of adultery. And if you know anything about Old Testament law, adultery was executable. Like, you could be executed for adultery. And excuse me. And so she went to the courts and said, no, I'm innocent. I'm still a virgin. Like, I would never do this. I would never bring shame upon myself. And she was a woman. So, like, obviously she was a liar. And then we get Daniel, who comes along. Daniel, as in Daniel is the lion's den, the big time prophet. And he believed her. But again, it took a man to believe her, right? And he starts questioning the two old men, and their stories don't match up. And the court's like, you guys are liars. So they get kicked out of the town. Susanna's reputation is saved. She does not have to die. And she lives a happy life after that. I'm assuming. They don't really mention everything that happens after in the Old Testament, but, you can assume nothing else bothered her because she doesn't get mentioned again. And so here, this is fairly soon after the trial wrapped up in her life. And so she's kind of painting herself, right? She's ashamed of what happened to her. She's facing these men because, of course, everybody in the court is a man. There's no woman jury. It's not a jury by your peers. And so she's facing the shame. But Susanna has a happy ending like she did. A man, aka her father, came in to save her. And so she's going to be okay. So this is kind of her first step in the healing process of accepting what has happened to her. And even though it's horrible, there was a way out. And at the end of the day, she came out okay on top, and she's going to have an okay life afterwards. And we can see almost that S curve with Susanna's body. And then the way that the men are leaning down, they're not just looking down, but they're kind of like leaning over her, kind of putting their power over her. And so again, this is her first step in her healing process. She explained herself through her art. And it just really resonates with me, not as an art historian just like that, but like also as a woman. Like, we've all been in uncomfortable situations. And here it's on the screen, and this is 400 years old. This is her most famous work. I am obsessed with it. It actually came to Seattle right before COVID, and I got to see it. And you can ask my friend Lisa, I bawled when I saw it because I loved this painting so much. It is Judith. So Judith and Holofernes, so this is about 10 years later. And this is the first version. She has another version that's in the Uffizi that's fairly similar. The colors are a little bit different, but the composition is relatively the same. So Judith was another Old Testament heroine, but instead of waiting for a man to solve her problems, Judith just rolled up her sleeves and solved them herself. So Holofernes was an Assyrian general, and the Assyrians were coming in to take over what was Israel at the time, and they were nearing her town. And it was a small town, so she knew it was going to get overrun, and she was probably going to be captured and put into slavery as a woman, right? So Judith goes, you know what I got that those dudes don't? Womanly charms. So she put on her best dress, grabbed a bottle of wine, and with her maidservant, and like sultrily walked over to Holofernes' tent. She's like, "What's up, baby?" And they drank wine together, and he passed out. And when he fell asleep, she pulled a sword out from who knows where, and boom, just cut his head off. I was like, "Oh my god!" Yeah, she cut his head off while he was passed out drunk. And she and her maidservant took his head as proof. And they snuck out, and the next morning the troops woke up, found their general dead, and they fled in terror because, oh my god, what happened to the general? And the village was saved, and Judith was a hero. Clearly, Artemise was taking her power back here, right? There's no sense of setting, so we can't place this anywhere. We know it's Judith and Holofernes by the title, but there's no setting. Instead, the focus is on the act of taking back power, right? She is grabbing his beard as a way to leverage herself. And like, I've never cut somebody's head off, but I can imagine how hard, I know, probably relief to the audience, right? But I can imagine just how hard it would be. Like, there's a lot of muscle, there's bone. And so to be able to just cut someone's head off when you're not trained with a sword like a soldier, that's got to be really difficult. But she's not afraid, right? She's got this like gritty look of determination on her face. Her maidservant clearly doesn't care. She's like, I'm here just doing the job I've been ordered to do. And she's holding him down. And if you look, there's rivers of blood flowing through the like almost velvet of the sheets on the bed, right? Because he's a general. He'd have the best bed in the army camp. And they're not afraid. They're taking back control. They know they're saving their village. They're saving Israel. And they're just doing what needs to be done. And Holofernes doesn't even look afraid because he's so shocked, right? His face is just frozen, like he was half woken up, and all of a sudden his head's gone. Like that's dramatic. And so I just love how it's just this taking back her power in a dramatic fashion. She's identifying with Judith the way that only someone who's experienced something like she had can. And I think it's just something we can identify with still all these hundreds of years later. But yeah, it's like her most famous work. I'm obsessed with it. I had a t-shirt, I like ruined it in the wash, that I made with this picture on it, and then over it I wrote "Slay the Patriarchy," but I washed it with something that should not have been washed with it, and like the letters fell off, so I did donate it, but I thought it was hilarious. And finally, we have self-portrait as the allegory of painting. And this is a full circle moment. So this is the image I used to talk about her biography, but this was painted towards the end of her career. She's living in London at this time. At this point, she has a husband. I don't remember his name because it's hardly ever mentioned. She's just her husband, which is amazing for at the time period, right? He is a stay-at-home husband who takes care of the children. Like in the 17th century, that is revolutionary. But from all accounts, because just this time we actually do have really good access to primary sources, he was happy to do so. He recognized her talent, saw that she could bring in the dough, and that he didn't have that level of talent in any trade, and he was happy to just take care of the house and be kind of her manager. You know, manage the funds coming in and out, making sure everybody was fed and taking care of their kids. And he traveled with her, and they had a great relationship by all accounts of like very equal footing for something you don't see in the 17th century. And this painting was just painted for herself as a full circle moment. So she's not necessarily Artemisma. She's a painter. She's the idea of a painter. And look at how she's not even looking at the viewer. She's so enraptured with her craft that we don't matter. Whoever's in the space outside of her doesn't matter. And she's kind of leaning around the canvas. I can kind of picture it where she's kind of looking at her reference and then going back and painting it, and looking at her reference and going back to the canvas and painting it. And her hair is not put up in this beautiful courtly hairdo that you would expect of a woman of this time period. It's kind of just thrown back. I mean, how many people just throw her hair up in a messy bun and call it a day, right? And her clothes, though, are still very fine. There's a nice sheen to it, so we can imagine it's satin or silk or something to that effect, showing that she was making good money as an artist, that she can afford these nice clothes to paint in. These are her work clothes. Imagine what her like going out for the evening clothes were. And so at this moment, she's fully come into her own. She is no longer Artemisma the victim. She's no longer Artemisma the revenger. She's Artemisma the artist. And this is her time to shine. And she was kind of forgotten about as most Baroque artists. Once the neoclassical period came along, nobody liked Baroque until it was really in the late 19th century that we started to rediscover these artists and fully appreciate their place in the history of Western art. And people started to discover her and see what amazing like feminist icon that she is. And today she's remembered as exactly that, feminist icon. Judy Chicago put her at a place setting for her in her dinner party installation, which is a giant like triangle dinner party with placemats for historical women that made an impact for women. And I just love her. It almost brings me to tears when I talk about her, because like obviously I don't know her. I will never know her. She's born way before I was. But as a woman, it makes me proud to call her like someone that I can admire and study, because she took her pain and her suffering and she turned it into something absolutely amazing. And I think that takes a true artist. And now we have another man. There's not that many women artists, unfortunately, until we get much later into the history of Western art. But I like Bernini too. Bernini is another man. And he was a sculptor and an architect. He did a little bit of painting, like clearly he's talented. This is the painting he did of himself, the self-portrait. But he saw himself first and foremost as a sculptor. And so Bernini, Gianlorenzo Bernini, was the son of another sculptor named Pietro, but clearly eclipsed his father. And he was discovered at a very young age. He was about 18 when he was discovered by a cardinal named Scipione Borghese, great name. And most of his early works are actually still held by the Borghese family. They have a villa way up in the northern part of Rome, right next to the American embassy, very important. And you can go look at them. It's amazing, because some of the works that he made are still in the rooms in which they were intended to be. And so you approach it from the angle that Bernini meant you to approach it, which is mind-boggling. And so Bernini was discovered very young, and he kind of became the golden boy of Rome. When Caravaggio was like the golden boy of painting, Bernini was the golden boy of sculpture and architecture, but even at a higher level. So he helped rebuild a lot of Rome, because the Catholic Church is pouring money into making the city beautiful, and they really marked Bernini for a lot of those projects. So if you guys have ever seen pictures of St. Peter's or have been there, they have that colonnade on the outside where it has those arms. That's Bernini. The outside of the church, that's Bernini. The inside of the church, most of that is Bernini or someone he hired to help him. And he did a lot of the fountains. Now, he didn't do the Trevi fountain. That's a guy who basically copy-pasted Bernini, but it's not him. But he did do several other fountains, and I'm going to show one in today's lecture. But he was not a nice person a lot when he was younger. That's why I call him the bad boy. So he had a giant workshop, right? And because he was famous and he had a lot of commissions. And so he'd come in with the original designs. The lower artisans would do the rough outlines. He would come in for the detail work. And he had this one guy who had a really hot wife named Costanza. And he was like, I'm the boss. I can do what I want. And he started having a relationship with Costanza. But Bernini also had a brother who thought Costanza was hot. So he started sleeping with her too. And Bernini was like, what the heck? That's not cool, man. Like, that's my girlfriend. And she's like, but I have a husband. He's like, that part we're not worried about. So instead of like being mature, he sent a servant to Costanza's house with a razor blade and attacked her face with it. And then the servant and the Costanza were arrested. And Costanza was put in jail for adultery, even though she had no say in any of this. And the servant boy was eventually put out on bail when it was realized he was just following the orders of his master. The brother actually fled Rome for a while because Bernini was like straight up trying to murder him. He actually had to go into a church and plead sanctuary in order to not be killed. And so the Pope actually came to Bernini's house and was like, bro, what the hell, man? I'm not even allowed to say that. I'm the Pope. I can't get you out of this one unless you marry someone and like cool your jets. Yeah, I know the logic is not good there, but this is the 17th century with men, so who knows? And Bernini's like, okay, I guess you won't arrest me if I get married. But apparently it worked. There were no more incidents after that. It really calmed him down. He and his wife had like 15 kids, and by all accounts, were very happy together. So apparently it worked. The brother eventually came back. They made up. Costanza was taken out of jail. She wasn't charged anymore. She had a lot of ugly scars. Her husband left her, so she's really the loser in this situation. But again, like, what a jerk move. But his art is so pretty and amazing. So it's hard. I mean, we get into it with Picasso, who was a jerk. Jackson Pollock. I hate Jackson Pollock's art, and I don't like him as a person. So that's why we're not doing the contemporary modern abstract expressionism with me, because I would just poo-poo on it the whole time. So this is one of 4 works that was commissioned at the same time by that Cardinal, Scipione Borghese, and it's called The Abduction of Persephone. You might also see it called The Rape of Proserpina. I don't like that name, so I call it The Abduction of Persephone, which is the more popular name as we're moving forward now. So he was only 23 when he sculpted this. So what we're seeing here is Hades abducting his niece, but again, they're Greek gods, so it doesn't count. Persephone into the underworld because he thinks she's pretty. And then later Demeter finds out who's her mother. She gets sad. The crops stop growing because she's the goddess of like crops and earth. And Persephone is allowed to come back only if she didn't eat anything. But she ate 6 pomegranate seeds while she was down there. And so for 6 months out of the year, she has to live in the underworld with her husband. And those are the months of fall and winter when no crops grow. And then when she gets to come back in the spring, her mother's happy again, and that's when the crops start to grow for spring and summer. That's how the Greeks explain the seasons. So here we're seeing Hades abducting Persephone, and like, look how dynamic that movement is. She's like punching him in the face to get away. You can see his face is like pulled up a little bit like this. She's twisting to get away from him. When you get up close to this work, which it's hard to do with a camera because they don't allow them very close, she actually has marble tears coming, just 2 little tears coming out of her tear ducts. Hades is like planting himself to hold her, and marble's heavy. And in ancient Rome, they used to just sculpt random tree stumps next to sculptures' legs to hold them up. But Bernini turned it into Cerberus, the 3-headed dog of the underworld. And so that's just another little fun like nod to Greek mythology. But my favorite part of this sculpture is how he carved flesh. This is a rock, people. This is a rock. It looks like he froze a leg. Like, I don't know how he did this. As someone who has no like kinesthetic abilities whatsoever, I'm very clumsy. I can't fathom being able to carefully shave that rock away to where you had to have looked at a way that fingers grab into flesh and do those indents. And the way his forearms, the muscles of his forearms and the veins are popping out with the way that you have to like hold on to somebody who's getting away from you. And like, even the spiral, you can see it just up in the corner of Hades' beard. You'd have to use basically, it looks like a wine corkscrew to shave the marble like that and not hope you break it off. Because it's not like painting where you can kind of rub it out if it hasn't set yet, especially with oil painting, which takes longer to dry. This is rock. They didn't have Gorilla Glue back then. You couldn't just like stick it back on. You made a mistake, you have to figure out how to then unmake the mistake. I just can't get over it. Like, since I saw this when I was in college, I went to Rome. I was very blessed to go there. And I sat there staring at this, probably with the security guards, probably just trying to steal it. She doesn't look like she's stealing anything. She's only 5'2". But like, I just like staring at it, like dumbfounded, because it looks even more amazing in person. And because it's made to be in that room, you really get the full sense of the story. This is another work by Bernini that I think is hilarious to contrast with this. So this is the Baldacchino or Baldacchine. It means canopy in Italian. And if you drew a line directly through the center into the ground, that's where St. Peter is buried. So this is in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. And fun fact, in the 60s, they actually opened it up to archaeologists. Now, of course, they were church trained archaeologists, but they found an old shrine dating from the 1st century with the word Petros carved into it, and an ossuary, which was used by 1st century Jews, which is essentially the bone box. And inside the box, there was skeletal remains, and they brought in forensic anthropologists, and they actually matched the set of remains that looked like it would be from about a 60-year-old man. So, of course, we don't have DNA or anything. But the fact that there was this single ossuary in an altar where they said St. Peter was buried and the bones match the age, and they can do, I don't know how it's science, but they basically can analyze the isotopes of the elements in bones to figure out where you grew up. And it matched the Middle East. So it actually it seems like St. Peter was actually buried here. So those are the bones that are in the crypt. You have to have like super clearance to go down there. There's a little gate at the bottom. So like the Pope and the cardinals and any special visitors like heads of state or whatever can go down there. So this Baldacchino is 94.3 feet tall, and it is made in bronze. Where did they get all that bronze, you might ask? Well, there's this building called the Pantheon in Rome, and it's the oldest surviving building of its kind, and it used to be a Roman temple. It was made into a Christian church in the 8th century, and it's a freestanding dome. It's actually the largest dome that the Romans ever built, and it had a coffered ceiling, so indents in the ceiling, and they were all had a bronze star. And Bernini looked at it, and he's like, they've had these stars for like 12 million years. They don't need them anymore. And the Pope let him take all the stars and melt them down to make this, which is fine, I guess. Like, he was the Pope, so he was allowed to, but like, it's kind of weird. And notice the columns, how they kind of go like this. That's called Solomon's temple column. And according to the Bible, that's what the columns at the second temple looked like when Solomon built it. And so that's why they're curvy like that. And so Bernini's trying to bring the idea of that Old Testament glory to New Rome, to the new Catholic Church. And cutely, the Pope at the time was Pope Urban VIII, weird name, and it was from the Barberini family. And their symbol, their sigil, was a bumblebee. So if you get close enough, there's actually little golden bumblebees all over the, because he was the one that sponsored it. For scale, those letters that are on the top right of the canopy, those letters are 10 feet tall. It goes around the dome and it says, Peter, on this rock I build your church, but in nicer Latin. And so it's basically this huge canopy. And let me tell you, I don't know if anybody here has been to St. Peter's. It's my favorite place in the entire world. I'm not Catholic, so it's weird. That's my favorite place. I have never felt more insignificant in my entire life than I have walking into that building, but in the best possible way, because it made me realize that I am not the center of everything. Humanity is not the center of everything. It's all of us together that create and make our world beautiful. And just walking through, even though this building was built in the 17th century, it's built on top of an earlier Christian building that was commissioned by Constantine in the 300s, built on Roman buildings, built on a hill that was settled by Neolithic people. And yet we're all still coming to this spot for some reason or another. And so in that moment, I was like, history everywhere. Like, I was so overwhelmed. Like, little 16-year-old Annalisa was just like taken aback. And it's shiny. I grew up Protestant. We don't do shiny as Protestants. And so to be like, this is a church. Dang, it was in the wrong denomination as an art historian. And so it's a beautiful, beautiful building. And I will warn you though, there are several dead popes in glass cases, Snow White style. So if you don't like, it looks just like Snow White. So if you're not cool with that, just a warning. They just pop out like there's randomly around the building. So just a warning there. This is Bernini's David. So this is in the same place as the Persephone sculpture. I love this David. He's in action, right? We get Michelangelo's David, who's just like coolly surveying, like, I'm gonna throw that rock. Yeah, that's a good plan. And Bernini's David's like, I'm throwing the dang rock. I hope it kills Goliath. And Bernini, you probably guess, is a little full of himself. So that's his face that he sculpted onto David, because why not? And he gave himself a nice set of abs, because why not? But I love you can see the tension in his ab muscles, because your muscles naturally, I mean, I don't have a lot of ab muscles, but I can imagine as someone with ab muscles that there's a lot of tension there as you're twisting and getting ready to put all of that kinetic energy to the rock so that it will kill the giant Philistine, giant Goliath. And just the way that his one foot is planted, but the other foot, like, it looks like somebody's in action, and the muscles and the tension reflect that. So just that Bernini was able to study the human form enough to accurately depict these muscles. And just a shepherd boy, like, they're both nude-ish on Bernini's side, very nude on Michelangelo's side. But they're not dressed up as in battle. They're supposed to be, he's a shepherd boy, right? He's not the king of Israel yet. He's just this random shepherd boy that thought maybe I can take on Goliath. You can even see that he's like a sheepskin satchel, a man purse. What is it termed? Belt bag. That's the word I'm looking for. All the rage belt bags these days. And you can imagine he was just walking through the fields and was like, oh, there's a battle going on. Check that out. And I don't know. I just love that Bernini made everything so dynamic. Yeah, the determination on his face is like, I'm gonna get that rock. I'm gonna get that giant. It's just so cool. I love Bernini. I'm a big Bernini fangirl, in case you couldn't tell. This is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. Let me tell you, teaching this to a bunch of 18-year-olds, very awkward. So St. Teresa is an actual lady, St. Teresa of Avila, and she was a religious mystic. So she received visions, which she wrote down, became very popular with the Counter-Reformation Church because it was like, look, God's real. She saw him. She wrote it down in her book. But the way she described the ecstasy of seeing this angel was about the arrow thrusting into her and giving her lots of pleasure and pain. Her face is sculpted. I purposely didn't show this zoomed up in my class. Her face is meant to look like she's having an orgasm. And the angel is literally going to thrust the arrow into her heart. And this was a big deal because it proved to the Catholic Church that God was real. He was sending angels down. He was giving people visions, and they were able to write them down and share them. And so the church, this is in Santa Maria della Vittoria, it's in the north of Rome, and the church commissioned it to show, like, this happened right around the same time. Like, this, he could read this book that had just basically been printed, and kind of get inspiration from that. So you can see he actually built clouds as a ledge coming out of the wall to support the sculpture. So he created this entire niche, and the golden rays are actually Bernini's design, because you can't really see it if you're a normal person because they don't let you that close. But if you're like a famous person, like Arthur, like Rick Steves probably could, you can get close enough. There's actually a window cut right above the golden rays so that when the sun's able to pass over, it's like, oh, the gold reflects off of it and then bounces off the marble, because this isn't taking place here. It's a vision. It's in her mind. It's in heaven. And so I just think it's one of those you have to mention because everybody knows it, because it was in Dan Brown's book, Angels and Demons. So that's how I first encountered it. And I was like 13, and I was like, I don't think I'm allowed to read this, but I did anyway. And yeah, everybody knows this work, but it's much more complicated than just like, ooh, she's in ecstasy. It's, no, this is the Catholic Church trying to prove that God is real. And so they're making a sculpture for maybe those who can't read or those who don't have access to these texts to tell the story. And kind of weirdly enough, he designed for the whole chapel. And on this side, like if you're facing the sculpture, it's on our right. He sculpted busts of the patrons that paid for it, and they're like watching. It's very weird. It's like, you know, in the Muppets, they have those two old guy Muppets, like, they banter back and forth. It's like those people. It's all a bunch of old men. That's what I was trying to say, old man Muppets bantering. So, and finally, it sounds way fancier than it is, the Fontana del Quattro Fiumi. It's the Fountain of the Four Rivers. That's literally what it means. And it's in the Piazza Navona in Rome. And the Piazza Navona is a big oblong oval shape, and it used to be a racing track. And then when Rome fell, they built houses around it. So it's actually a piazza that used to be the center of the racing track, and the racing track has now become homes. If you're facing the statue here on our left is a church called Santa Agnes, St. Agnes. And there's catacombs, and you can go into the catacombs, and there's still early Christians buried there, and it's creepy but cool. I went down there with my class, and I was like, I feel weird about seeing these dead people and like ogling them, but like I'm also an early Christian historian, so it's really cool. Like it was very conflicting, and I don't like being underground, but it's a really cool way to see the catacombs without having to go way outside of Rome. And so this was commissioned by the Pope again to build up this area because it kind of fallen into disrepair. They wanted to make it pretty again, and what better way to make it pretty than stick a giant fountain in the center of it? Water is obviously essential to humanity, but it's a big part of Rome because the Romans built aqueducts, and a lot of them are still in use today, surprisingly. They're that well engineered. So they bring water down from the mountains. It's delicious. It's like Pacific Northwest water. It's just melted snow. And there's fountains all over Rome where you can just like unscrew the tap and fill up your water bottles for free and it's like crisp, pure water. Or you can push your finger, like clog it basically, and it makes a little fountain. It's so cool if you don't have a reusable water bottle. And so these fountains are fed by these aqueducts, so it's reinforcing that Roman heritage. And the center is an obelisk. Now, it's not an Egyptian obelisk. It's actually a Roman obelisk because Romans had like a weird relationship with Egypt where they wanted to conquer it, but they also liked it. They like single white females the Egyptians a little bit. Like, oh, I want to make my own obelisk. So this is actually made by Diocletian in like the 200s, but it was still old enough for Bernini to be like, yeah, that's ancient enough. And so he used the obelisk as kind of an anchor point to rest all of the marble on. And he created the 4 rivers of the 4 discovered continents at the time, and celebrating water and its importance to the city of Rome. So we have, to represent Asia, we have the Ganges River, which is in India. They're not supposed to look like the people that lived there. It's more of the idea of water and the way that Romans viewed water in their time, of like, there's a river nymph or river god that lives there and is the spirit. So that's why he looks like a Roman god and not like a Hindu deity, even though they didn't know what Hindus were. The Nile River is covering his head. And not because the Nile is in Egypt and it's hot. It's because behind him, the church was designed by Bernini's arch rival. And so Bernini didn't want his river looking at it. So he just sculpted the river covering his head so his work didn't have to acknowledge his rival's work. The De La Plata is in South America. And I love this guy because he kind of looks like one of the 7 dwarfs worked out a bunch. Because he's leaning back and blowing wind because you have to take a ship to get to South America and you need wind to have a ship. It's very literal. So he's just blowing on the wind, relaxing as he's going to South America. And then finally, we have the Danube, who is slightly facing that same church. So he doesn't need to cover his head as much, but he still is turning away from the facade of that church that Bernini's rival designed. And so the Danube is obviously the European one. But I love it because he's almost tipping over. Like he's drunk, like his leg is hooked onto that rock for dear life so that he doesn't completely tip over. And they're all kind of in some form of movement, right? They're not just posing as the river god. They're all moving or relaxing or showing off the ability of the sculptor and making it so that there's a sense of movement, just like water moves throughout the fountain. It's not going to just be static and dynamic. It's all this dynamic piece that works together. And again, this is rock. Like, I don't know how it worked. Like, I don't know. But I just find it so amazing that we have this idea of like that rock can be manipulated like flesh, and Bernini really showed that. That is everything I have for you today. I'm open, questions, all that good stuff. I really appreciate you coming out. I love talking about Baroque art. In case you couldn't tell, it's fun and has stories. Like this is the time period where we get artists being people versus artists being craftsmen. And so we have stories about their life and we can understand how it impacts their art. So thank you so much for coming. Yeah.